So it's on pause now.
General University panel. At this time, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Colonel Dillon.
Everything you wanted to know about preventive policing and never cared to ask. I think there's been a lot of introduction of concepts and things, where we're going to go, how we're going to turn those concepts into capabilities. And nothing can be more fundamental. If you're the military police and you do policing, however that's defined, what is your strategy? As Tracy said, he was in an audience with a large group of military police senior leaders, and he talked about, well, what's our policing strategy? And unfortunately, there was a little crickets chirping, and I think that's collectively, and I point the fingers inward as being a part of that cohort and thinking about how we get there. So when we walk away, and we're introducing concepts such as, for the first time for some people seeing it, saying we have a preventive policing strategy, and then we're going to roll it out in a strategic plan and possibly define it better in doctrine and move forward and resource it. Maybe it deserves just a little bit of a drill down to kind of tell you how we got here and what the evidence was, what the research said to get to where we are. When we think about our three core competencies of policing, investigations, and corrections, maybe this pillar needs a little bit of a drill down so the senior leaders leading this audience, and when these concepts are rolled out in a strategic plan, they can look to their junior leaders and or their decision makers or the customers that they work for, the newer commanders they work for, and be able to slightly articulate, hey, here's where we got this, and this is why we're doing it, and this is why it's value added to you as we go forward. So, what I would say is, I was very proud back in 2011 to help try to stand up policy and plans in OPMG, and General Quantock gave me a team, and we led an effort to do a strategic assessment of a regiment and the military police force at large for the first time since 1978. 1978 was the last institutional that I could find where we actually did an assessment and did a SWOT assessment of our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats at the strategic level. And that was in response to the emerging air-land battle doctrine. And I think that most of us in the room were around towards the end of the 80s and know that that's what we were living. So at some point in time, things that we took as the way we did things, it was new. And that's where we are today. We're thinking about that as we go forward. And again, I reiterate, what got us to where we are now may or may not, depending on what the Army wants to do, get us to where we need to go. And so we have to think anew of that. The good news story is, what the Army's asking for, at least how we're interpreting it is our core competencies. And we should be comfortable with that, and we should re-explore that and refine that and move ahead. So, as we went forward, there was research on the strategic analysis. A lot of it was historical. We looked at both professional and academic criminal justice review of literature to include, not just in the abstract, here's what the best civilian police practices are doing, how does that apply to what we do in combat? No, at that time, there was a lot of information where people were actually looking at what we were doing in combat and drawing parallels and talking about the effectiveness of that, to include David Bailey, Robert Pareto, writing books called Policing in War, Police Roles in War, and what does that look like? So there was some research to how we got to where we are. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. So bear with me. These are theoretical, conceptual slides. If you think about the active arm of our three core competencies, and you say, well, okay, well, that's not policing, that's patrol. Well, we are patrol-based. If you look at combat support companies, if you look at law and order detachments, there's a reason why we have so many vehicles. We do mounted patrol. That's what we do. That's how we get after what we need to do. So while this may really be referring to policing, I use the active concept of patrolling to go along with the active work of investigations and corrections. And if you look at theoretically a level of technical expertise, and when we did our assessment back in 2010, we do pretty good in investigation and corrections. We have accreditation, we have certifications, well respected. Not so much that we're not respected for patrol, but we need to focus in some aspects. And this was the assessment at the time is we need to move this up and maybe move all three up to a level of technical expertise that the Army's going to need in the future based on the demands that are coming out. And if you look, there's an interesting line right down here. And this would be, let's say, a business process continuum from left to right, that patrol generally is our face to the public. That's who they see first. There's more of us. That is our whole purpose, is to be present. And so if you have an incident, and that's probably a poor way to describe an input to our business process, let's say it's a call for service, customer walks in, we run into somebody on the street, somebody's asking for questions, maybe it's on the battlefield and we're interacting with the local population. if you think about a business process, if our level of expertise here is here, and the investigations and corrections is up here, and it's a left to right process, someone's apprehended, there's an investigation, there's a judicial process, and then you go into long-term incarceration as a system. If you were down here, you're going to cause this right here to have to do more work. So the concept is that we try to balance our level of technical expertise and not overly, we're not saying we're overly focusing on policing, but you know, if you're good here, what's the old thing that we commanders do? You sustain your strengths and you improve your weaknesses or perceived challenges. And so that's what this slide is kind of showing us. It's policing as a system, and that's how we have to think of it. Now, granted, anti-terrorism, physical security, that's not in there. I'm not saying that's grouped under patrol, investigations, or corrections. It is still a part of the system, but this is a very fundamental slide where we're just talking about our very broad core competencies as we showed up to the Army. Okay, definition of policing. And I've been working with, as the former policy and plans chief who kind of helped get MP4's 2020 plan going and the refinement of 2025, there's been a lot of talk and the word policing has become forefront and it slips off of our tongue very easily. But now we're at the point where people say it so much, we haven't really defined it. And that's a problem because we're at a level where we do need to define it because now we're trying to start implementing it and not talk about it in the abstract. And as we went through, and again, a definition. This is something that we're offering to be inclusive into the MP strat plan as a concept, also possibly look at a doctrine, how do we refine doctrine and be a little more refined to what are we getting out of the AOC and what does that whole, that competency look like vis-a-vis corrections and investigations. So we actually had 3 framing problems as we came out with policing. The first is it is used in a context of we're military police, we do policing. Well, that would lead you to the assumption that everything fits under policing. And what I would tell you is I'm recommending that that's not the case. I think we were very clear we need to stick to this, that we are military police. There are slight differences from us and civilian police. And then when we were re-looking at Headquarters Department of the Army Order Number 1, which outlines staff roles and responsibilities, it was clearly articulated that we went with the leading word, the leading sentence for us is that military police are responsible for the police function in the Army. And then subsequent paragraphs and subsequent parts of that did go into talking about the subtask to the function of police. So we may want to take that off the table. Policing as one of the 3 core competencies. Let's come back to that, because that's where I think we ought to go. Policing and law enforcement used synonymously. Okay, if you go back and really look at, again, at the review of literature, professional, academic, criminal justice, think tanks, clearly all the evidence tells you, and what we're seeing is, policing is a mission. It is not necessarily a task. Law enforcement is a task under that policing mission. They are not on opposite ends of how we do things. So, if it is accepted that policing is one of our 3 core competencies, what does that definition look like as we pull it from a review of literature? And how can we massage it to be a concept that we think about in raising up the terms of reference and the underlying concepts of what we do as military police? And when I say patrol, I mean both law and order type detachments, combat support, patrolling in combat. So it should be able to fit across a range of operations. So defined as policing is a mission with 3 components, interrelated components, I would say. The first is maintaining public order through voluntary compliance. If you think about the AOC, the first thing in the AOC, the challenges for the United States Army is there's always going to be more people in space than the Army can directly control. So philosophically, if we develop our knowledge set and our expert knowledge and the ability to maintain public order through voluntary compliance, we are helping the Army. And that concept needs to be fleshed out. Another interrelated component of policing is the prevention of crime, and I said other threats because I think we do need to expand it beyond just crime. It needs to include those other types of irregular threats that hide in plain sight that have characteristics of how criminals act. And that is a lot of the literature from the past 10 years was that they saw in insurgents and guerrillas certain types of behaviors from organizationally that criminals had. So prevention of crime and other threats by identifying and solving underlying problems and conditions. Preventive policing, problem-oriented policing. That's another concept. And then lastly, interrelated, is the discretionary enforcement of law. So yes, law enforcement is a task underneath policing, but if it's going to be considered a part of policing, it's very discretionary. Words matter. Along the top and the bottom, if you think of this as a back and forth continuum of how we want to approach policing, this is where we really want to be. We just want to be coasting, maintaining order, not a lot of problems. But when there's an anomaly in the public, and it's rising up to the level of potentially causing harm, we're going to go into action. And we have to be very proactive about this. And if we can't get there, and maybe the solution or response that we find to a crime is going to cause us to say, okay, we need to cut an apprehension, and we need to start moving this forward. But ideally, we want to be here. Ideally, the effectiveness of policing is the absence of crime and disorder, not the visible evidence of us dealing with it. And there's a practical matter, that's practical too. Because if you think of over here versus over here, personnel needed work effort, it takes a lot more people and a lot more effort if your only solution to crime is to apprehend everybody and put them in the system and put them in long-term incarceration. That's very expensive. And actually, when you think of the interrelation here, I know that from a CID perspective, their caseload is always up here. But work with me on this. If indirectly, at the front, indirectly, at the front end of this business process, you are actually preventing crime, and we're putting in equal technical efforts and knowledge into preventing crime, you actually, in the long term, reduce the caseload a little bit, and you reduce the number of individuals we may or may not have in incarceration. So this is policing, military police as a system. On the corollary, if you're operating up here, and you do have an absence of crime, that is not a given. It takes a lot of work, but in other ways. It takes professional expertise, it takes intellectual effort at the managerial level, and understanding how to bring to bear a lot of different capabilities that we may or may not have right now, but are not at the level that we need them to be. I just want to stop for a second. Anybody have any thoughts on this? Is this the right direction as we seek to define this better, as we seek to put it into concepts and move it to capabilities? Because I will talk about how we can translate. Here's the abstract, and in about 2 slides, I'm going to talk about how, from requirements to capabilities, how we came up with why criminal intelligence is important, and why police management is important, and why increasing our individual competency and professional knowledge is important to be able to execute this type of concept, and this is an organizational goal. Steve?
Rob, just a thought that what it says about policing, I don't disagree with what you got there, but it doesn't make it really military policing. I think there's an effect that commanders have on the discipline of a force.
Excellent.
It also maintains public order through voluntary compliance. So we actually have commanders that help us do part of that job. Now, I don't know how you show that in this, but to me, this could be any policing, not just military policing. Without kind of the environment that's behind that, I think it's just missing something. I just don't know where to put it.
You're absolutely right. So we go back to the impact of crime and saying, hey, well, you know, if we look at crime, barbecue grills being stolen, is it worth the millions of dollars spent for law? Well, that's inaccurate. That may be a civilian model you can think of, but in the Army, we are still an organization. And so victims and offenders that need to go through this process are expensive. And there's a lot of sunk costs. Victims that need counseling or whatever, they get out, we have to re-recruit to put them in, that's expensive. But to your point, in a very abstract way, or the concept is voluntary compliance, that could be voluntary compliance in the civilian policing mode where we're trying to work with the public. It also could be us helping commanders by providing that expertise and saying, you know, for example, I know one time Fort Drum was producing quarterly crime reports that are individualized to the BCT that said, hey, here's what you got going, boss. Here's what you need to do about it. And then the last paragraph is here how we as the military police are going to help you get after this. So you're absolutely right. We have commanders we work through, and that's good. Because if you think about victims, offenders, and locations, 99% of the time, commanders own the victims, offenders, and locations. So if we're educating commanders properly about and providing the actionable intelligence, that's the key. Not just data. Hey, you got a crime problem, BCT commander. No, you got to give them actionable intelligence. And here's what we recommend you do about it, because we have trained our leaders in a process called problem-oriented policing, and we have techniques that we can offer you that either you can do, or I can do, or we can do them together. Does that make sense? Did you?
One of the things we were wrestling with is uniquely because we're customer driven with our senior leaders and our publics. One of the challenges we have is the perception versus the reality. And so with limited manpower and limited time, how do you bring those two together so that you're not addressing the perception of disorder? For example, I'm getting traffic last night about trash behind the PX. Clearly, that's not a policing issue. At the same time, the criminal reality is that we have ungoverned spaces that nobody's aware of. We have criminals doing things in the training areas. And because there's not families or senior leaders living there, we don't take the time or have the time to focus on that the way we need to. So one of the elements, I think, of a good policing model is how to close the perception-reality gap and deny the criminals those seams that they're playing right now. The more we're focusing on like senior leader housing, which is important. It's important on the assist part of it. The less you're dealing with, the way that criminals are getting on post, the way that they're funding their operations, dealing drugs in the training areas or what have you. So I think perception and reality needs to be accounted for.
Absolutely. So, and a part of review of literature, there is a lot of that, and a lot of police departments, and we can apply this to a combat situation too. We all know the old saying, perception is reality. And so if we're trying to help the maneuver commander consolidate operational gains, and yet in the public, in the population centers, there's still the perception that the threat is winning or this, that, and the other, and we're not helping. So we need tools and expert knowledge to be able to get out there and help. So let's bring that example back to the garrison. And Ross probably lives this as much as I did, and that is that we have 2 non-contiguous housing areas at Fort Hood. Routinely, they will bend the CG's ear, they will bend the garrison commander's ear, that they are just, Attila the Hun is roaming around in the 2 housing areas that are non-continuous to the installation. But what did the data show us? There was like a 0.4% difference. So what do we do about that? Well, when we talk about moving the doctrine, we need to flesh this out. And one of the things, talking with General Marine about it, is we may introduce a MP operational framework that takes us through planning, preparing, executing, assessing, and then we may include some annexes that show examples. So if you have, let's just say you have for DES, you have a goal of reduce and control crime, reduce and control disorder, reduce and control fear of crime. And a lot of that is going to be perception management. And when we think about targeted patrols, if that's what you're getting, a targeted patrol would be, okay, when do people get home from work? From 4 o'clock to 1900. Okay, patrols. Here's your patrol script. Here's your patrol order. Here's the PIR I want you to collect on. Go out and engage the public. Let's survey the public and see if we can't reduce that perception that they are more dangerous. So it's about going to be up here. To do that, like you said, it's going to be up here, and it's going to require us to further refine to the similar level of expertise that our investigative and corrections brothers have to the level of patrol and policing. And being able to broadly look at it and apply those kind of things to helping the Army, not in garrison policing only, but in concepts of engagement and operating in the human domain and human aspects of military operations. Does that answer your question? Cool. Any other concepts of how this could work?
Hey, Rob, would you characterize a patrol in your previous slide as similar to an RNS plan for a BCT commander?
Yes. I think I've been guilty of in the past that I reject and say, that's law enforcement, that's combat support. Okay, well, maybe the problem is we're looking at too low of a level. We're looking at skill level 1. We're looking at what's really different versus what's really the same. Yes, law enforcement kit is different from our IBA and our helmets and this and the other. Yes, patrol vehicles, Ford patrol vehicles are different from the Joint Light Tactical vehicle. Yes, but what are they? What's similar? They have 4 wheels. We have to have a plan for how we patrol. It has to be intelligence led, and we have to come to the realization that random patrols equal random results, and we need to be more technical in what we do and how we guide them. And I think some of those principles at the higher level of strategy and tactics and management have maybe a crossover of about 80%. Yes, they're different. Fire maneuver with an M2, mounted or dismounted, is not something you're going to do in a garrison. However, we cannot confuse that with our mission. That's a means to an end. Every soldier should be able to do mounted and dismounted squad level fire maneuver. That's a means to an end. It is very important for survivability and lethality on the battlefield. But in the end, we're going after a mission to be able to get it done, if that makes sense. Anything else on that, Steve?
Yeah, mine's actually more of a comment too. Is especially when we get into the middle circle, we're talking about the prevention of crime. Yeah, other threats, immediate other threats. I think it's really critical that we have that capacity built in there to look at, the niche capabilities we have that learn in the garrison side and apply within the operational environment. Because the management of this side of things, the ability to do that, beyond just doing law enforcement. I'll say that the term just management, while we call it all they do is law enforcement. But now you bring in capacity. Okay, we can do different intelligence aspects to it. We can do the forensics aspects. We can do the biometrics aspects to it. And these are all things that come into play in the daily policing things. We can build the capacity within our garrison environment that translates very well into the environment, which will help us out.
And I think we have doctrine for conducting combat operations and troop movement procedures, and how we do collection management, ISR management. We need to cross-pollinate. So I mean, the thing between patrol and garrison and patrol and combat, you still have pre, during, and post-execution checks. You still have pre-briefs, intel pre-briefs, and you want debriefs. You still are having collect, analyze, and disseminate intelligence. You're still, applying protection concepts, big and small, across all range of military operations. So it may require a little bit of different thinking how we do things, but I think mostly we have some of the means that we need. We can always do more with means. Don't want to say we don't need anything. But I'm saying a lot of what we're doing is a change in mindset of how we go forward in a third way versus it's law enforcement versus combat. And those actually seem to be coming together more and are actually being demanded as higher technical skills that the Army needs, as seen in the AOC, and a lot of the learning demands that are sub to this Army warfighting challenge. Nobody's answering those. Somebody's going to answer them, as Chief and I talked about. Somebody's going to answer those questions and solve those problems for the Army. It should be us, but somebody will answer those questions. I'm sorry, Eric.
I agree with you, Ralph, as far as looking at this very differently, because from my perspective in the corrections world, over 80% of our inmates are sex offenders, and many of those are child sex offenders. So when you go to your first oval there, maintain public order and voluntary compliance, how do we get through to people before they become a child sex offender? How as military police do we do that? Because most of our inmates are in that category, and how do we get there before they get to the facility, before they commit the crime? Because a lot of these things are happening behind closed doors, and it's the kids that are coming forward and reporting, not necessarily we as MPs are finding out through our policing tactics. It's children that are coming forward.
Oh, okay. Probably something we could flesh out in doctrine for the concepts, but if you had a imaginary triangle or funnel, you have 1,000 actual crimes, and by the time you get down to the end of the funnel, the criminal justice process, you might actually have 4 people going into incarceration. That's not a military police model or Army model, it's a civilian model. But my point is, along the ways, there's 60% of crime is not reported. But as we think about us as a system, you talk about police on the front end, investigations in the middle trying to get through the court case, and then corrections at the bottom for long-term incarceration. We have to work as a system. There's an intelligence function. In some cases, and I know we have policy problems and legal issues of not being able to do this, but once those prolific offenders are actually in incarceration, some best practices say that's the time to interview. Hey, how did you commit your crimes? How did you pick your victims? How did you do this? And I'm not saying it's perfect to get after exactly what you're saying, but the results of that information at the bottom of the funnel once they're in incarceration, depending on legal rights and whether the lawyer says they can't talk anymore, if you can determine good aggregate data what the MO is, that could be something that's fed back up into the policing portion of it, and we look at ways that we can look at preventing those things. I don't really think that's answering your question, but I think we do have to work as a system after, maybe it's criminal intelligence versus crime intelligence. We're getting after the MOs of how sexual assault is conducted, and physical security may come into a part of this. Maybe peepholes. I don't know. I'm just being hypothetical, but I don't think I answered your question, but I think part of going forward is working as a system.
I think part of the answer is going to be when we brief the Army Crime Report. I think we are going to see, and I think we've seen for the past 4 years, there are trends and there are crimes of a sexual nature that occur as part of a standard grooming, that if we as a force, not just a military police force, but as an Army, commanders partnered with law enforcement, could better identify and provide that actionable intelligence to commanders. And we're also seeing a trend where we as law enforcement and commanders are not notifying the family advocacy programs and those other programs. There's a gap where we could get left of the bang so that inappropriate
Left of the
touching,
bang is a good way to put it.
inappropriate touching doesn't wind up to a aggravated sexual penetration and wind up in your custody. And I think we're going to start seeing some of that, and we have seen it several years, but I think you're going to start seeing some of the things when we brief the Army Crime Report.
And I think part of why we're doing kind of a key takeaway drill down on this is and Dave just brought up a great point. I think we have to advertise preventive policing as our strategy. I think we got to boil it down to concepts that our maneuver commanders and the community understand. Hey, why are we doing this? What are we doing? Because we're trying to get to the left of bang on crime. That may be a bumper sticker. I don't know, but messaging is going to be important.
Hey Rob, can you go back to the previous slide? One of the reasons why, and it's an observation, something that I've struggled with the whole time I've been in the MP Corps, is the two on the right are the ones that we completely control on our own. There's no real interaction with the rest of the Army, investigations and corrections. We have the doctrine, it's not something that we have to interact with the larger combined Army. It's the one on the left where young lieutenants, company commanders struggle trying to learn the rest of the Army, the doctrine of the Army, how to integrate into a VCT. And those skills, those maneuver skills are very complicated, and it takes a long time to teach an MP lieutenant how to speak the language of a VCT and to get and to talk to a battalion commander and talk his language. And that language is jargon heavy and it's very complicated. So I think that's why we struggle on the left-hand side to show relevance to that audience. The ones on the right, we don't have to do that. That's why we're so proficient in those. I mean, it's complicated to do a platoon attack. It's complicated to react to contact, movement to contact, those things. And those are all skills that have to speak the language of the people you're supporting. So putting the doctrine below and then also being able to speak the Army's language, it's going to be difficult. When you get to be a major and a lieutenant colonel, you sort of master that. But we struggle at the beginning with trying to do both.
No doubt. I don't know what everybody else's experience is first of all, there's getting in the door and then there's actually being heard. To get in the door, the platoon leader, the company commander has to show up to a BCT rock drill, and you better be speaking tactical tasks, tactical terms, proper symbology. I would say, yeah, and that's a steep learning curve, not one I don't think that we can't handle, or our young company commanders can't handle. And I think it's actually maybe a good thing that planning, for planning purposes, basis of allocation based on METC as a company supporting a BCT, as a general rule, with that level of more experience under their belt, the company commander can engage a little better. But I do think battalion commanders and brigade commanders have shaping opportunities they have to do. But back to your point, at some point in time, if all we do is talk like maneuver commander using that language, you got to take that one step further and have technical expertise and use terms that also say, okay, well, you are also different, and you're bringing something to my fight that I don't have. Tell me more about that. I'm intrigued. How are you going to help me with that problem? And so maybe the twist is less about, here's my 4 battlefield missions, and more about, hey, sir, I studied your plan for your upcoming exercise. You have these 3 gaps and problems. I can help you with that. And maybe that's something as gentlemen, as we go forward, that's part of our leader development, that's scenarios we run. Because you're right, I think MP leaders have to be a little more mature than our peers to be able to walk the walk and talk the talk. It's difficult. Concur with you. John?
Yeah, Rob, so how do you communicate to the population you're policing that these things are happening? You can't just flood the zone like Gingy talked about. These efforts are happening on our installations, and I think in the Army there's a reluctance to share some of that information. When bad things happen, people just kind of go away. We don't have that preventative effect. I know as I looked at NPFU, I wanted to publish a crime report a couple of years ago, the big offenders, all the companies that had fraudulently conducted business with the Army. The pushback I got from a lot of senior leaders was, oh, we can't do that. The Army will be punished for lack of oversight. But it seems like we've got to communicate these things. You're not always going to see a patrol vehicle with its lights on in sector. You're not, going to see those. You've got to communicate that these things are really happening. And there's a reason the FBI has a top 10 list, top 10 most wanted list. There's a reason they wait till every reporter's there when they do their press conference. So, but it's got to be systematic. It's got to be part of the system, just like you talked about.
I think when we look at critical task selection for leaders, one of the things we have to consider is informed influence skills. So, I mean, going back to a garrison policing example, working with my CID brother, we had a death of natural causes in a housing area. If you didn't get on the social media first, you would have a thread this long that somebody had infiltrated on the base and it was a double, triple murder and this, that, and the other. Whereas maybe the answer is, the DPS and CID together putting a Facebook entry into that housing area and saying very quickly, here's some facts, this is what happened. Your local military police are aware of it and investigating at this time. There's nothing you can, whatever you want to say, the message you want to say. So we have to become, in the fear of crime and the perception around, both tactically, downrange and here, we're going to have to be involved in fusing and what is the strategic messaging or tactical messaging to get ahead of that. Because you're right, how do you control and get voluntary compliance? We're going to have a serious component of understanding social media and information ops.
But strategically, we have another audience. And so I remember as a CID commander wanting to say, hey, we did this awesome thing, and we caught this guy, and we got a great trial, and the guy's incarcerated forever. And you want to talk about that, but you can't because we have a second strategic audience, which is the American public. And our senior leaders don't necessarily want to highlight it that we had a guy who was offending children that we had to put into prison. So we have an internal strategic audience that we want to influence and show that we're having an impact. But we also have an external strategic audience that we don't necessarily want to articulate our problems.
Great discussions. May have to sidebar someone. Okay, reactive versus preventive policing. What's the underlying? Okay, well, who cares, Dillon? Why are we doing this? Well, part of our research and part of our analysis, and this is a simple model. I mean, preventing things, getting to the left of the boom, is more effective, efficient, more value-added, and it's more moral in our line of work. Crime victimization, victims are not cars. They don't go down the same line. There's a moral component, moral responsibility to us to help the maneuver commander not just preserve life because it's our job, because it's a moral responsibility in our profession. So that could be thought of. But this should be a model that we think about that's applicable under all conditions. So, push the right button. You have an underlying condition which leads to a problem. That problem can lead to incidents. Right now, when you think about some ways that we do things, it's kind of the 3 R's. Random patrol, rapid response, and reactive investigation. 3 R's. So what you get is a do loop. Same problem, same underlying conditions, different incidents. Same house you're reporting to, same spot on the MSR, same village is having the same problem, causing problems for the maneuver commander. And there we are. After there's insanity, he's doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. We need to change that. And again, this is where our mindset is important. Not a lot of, I don't know that we need a new phaser tase gun in 2020. We need to change how we think about things and just use what we already have. So you go to this. You aggregate this information, and you analyze it, you figure out what your response is going to be. You come up here and you attack the underlying conditions. Just like Nick Savone talked about, what the blue struggles with is attacking the underlying conditions, which causes the tactical problems, which stymies the maneuver commander from being able to consolidate his security gains and have a sustained security outcome to conflict. We fight wars for a better peace. And if we can't consolidate on the objective, the operational objective to achieve that, if we're not helping in that area, then somebody else is going to help the Army do that. But we ought to be the people doing it. So a change in our mindset from the platoon sergeant, platoon leader, all the way up, this is scalable, should be how we do this. It's problem solving. We address those. And to Gingy, to your point, at some point in your analysis and response, we're trying to do things efficiently, and we want somebody else to walk away with the monkey on their back. We're trying to shift and share responsibility for solving these underlying conditions and these problems, not just us. Because if it's just us, it's like you said, give me more police. That's not going to work. A police chief in some civilian community, when he's having a crime problem, says, I need more police to solve this problem, he's going to get fired. And in our case, we're not going to get additional resources, so we better figure out how to get after the crime problem and the disorder problem, and or other tactical problems in the human domain for the maneuver commander. Okay, so what's the evidence tell us? We have in our doctrine, we talk about community policing, we talk about potentially standard policing, or what I call the 3 Rs, intelligence-led policing, and currently in our doctrine we say there's different approaches that you can look at in using these tools. Okay, well what the evidence says, and I think we need to think about this, is in 1968, when there was problems with policing, if you remember, it's President Johnson that had a commission on law enforcement and the administration of justice. It was huge, it was sweeping. And one of the do-outs from that 1968 commission was they wanted a long-term study of what's fair and effective in policing. 25 years later, 2004, they did publish a report from the National Academies of Science, and it was entitled Fairness and Effectiveness in Policing, the Evidence. And this is what the evidence said after they did a study of 25 years. There's a resource right here. You have a continuum. On the left side is the diversity of approaches to policing. Just law enforcement, or are you trying other things? Little gray. On the bottom is the focus of effort. Is your activities intelligence and analytically led? Well, in some cases, absence of definite policy and absence of bright spots, this is what we do. We do random patrols. I don't say that's policy that we have. I'm not saying that we're not doing intelligence-led policing. I'm saying as a structured strategy that we advertise, this is kind of where we are. And we want to move in this direction. Does that mean community policing is not effective or intelligence-led policing is not effective? No, not at all. It actually gets you to here. But community policing doesn't have a lot of focus, and it's limited effectiveness over long term. Intelligence-led policing is great. You have a high level of focus, but the tools for your response are generally law enforcement. Where we want to go is up here. And beyond just saying, hey, there's a problem, and you go back to the model I just showed, you know, how do we come up with doctrine? How do we put in the hands of young leaders? How do you actually do that? That's where Sarah came from. Not Sarah O'Brien. SARA. Scan, analyze, respond, assess. And it has components that have to be flushed out with required capabilities at the small end and at the high end to be able to do that. CAD, being able to translate CAD data or movement blue for data into crime mapping or mapping of tactical problems and analysis of those tactical problems over time. So when we say a preventive policing structure and we say maybe a good model to use is problem area policing, and all models are wrong, but some are useful. So this is not perfect. This is where we will look at. Not to belabor this, but this is kind of important. Anybody, any thoughts on?
In your experience, when you were at the Hood and using these things based on anecdotal, what I've heard occurred during your tour, did you feel that either your two or our MPs had the analytical training to be able to analyze criminal data and produce actionable intelligence, or was there a big difference between the analytical capabilities of an MI officer looking at enemy templates and criminal crime data? Because my personal belief is we do a great job of, we have great maps, we have great data, but we have very limited capabilities to produce intelligence. We have a lot of information, but we don't have much intelligence. And I'm just curious if your thoughts are we have that capability that we can leverage from the tactical side of the house, or do we really need to focus on the policing and analytical side?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I don't want to make it all about any one person's personal experience, although that matters. I would say what was important at that time, and even started back in the 709, when Steve Gavix and Sarah can talk about this, Tom Blair.
Yes, I am.
Thank you for the $250,000 you got from General Fontaine for the training. But the important part was we didn't go off on a tangent on the training, and what was important is that USAMPs, I'll get to your question. First, what was done in some different experiences in different units, first the concept, and then to your question. It was very helpful, and this may be a model, General Crane. It was very helpful that USAMP said, hey, we're going to get on board. We need to have industry standards so that we can have joint interoperability, to be able to talk, and ICS, and they chose the standard of International Association of Law Enforcement Intelligence Analysts. Thank you very much. There's clearly 20 to 25 competencies that are trained for a basic crime analyst. We found an individual in California, an Alpha Group. TradeOps used them before. He teaches across many police departments. I know some of you may not use Alpha Group. I think Roger, you have Alpha Group guys come. And they offer scalable training from crime intelligence, basic crime analysis, to criminal intelligence, MOs and stuff like that, more broad. But to the point, yes, we took out of Hyde some junior enlisted soldiers that had an aptitude, that wanted to do it. We brought the civilian trainer in who taught to a standard that USAMS had approved. Now, by the way, it's in Adobe now. 5525.18 says permit is the word we're going to use, and ILEA is the training standard we're going to go with. The problem with that is that it comes with institutional problems, because once you train up somebody to that level, they get out of the Army to go work for, Newport Police Department. So, but yeah, we can do it at that level as long as we have, those skills. And to your point about MI is very good at coming to the field with very definite institutionalized procedures. The problem is, as you walk it up from information to knowledge, from data to information to knowledge to intelligence, it's the knowledge part. They can do all those processes. The problem is they don't have individuals who have an in-depth knowledge of criminal theory and so they can't make sense of the data. They can't make sense of the data because they don't understand criminological theory. And really, we don't need to be going down the road of teaching young soldiers to be PhDs in sociology. You did this because your mom didn't like you. What we need is more evidence-based stuff that's easier to understand and operationalized at the company level with basic patterns, trends, and analysis. And I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. So how do we get to the requirements? Why we keep talking about PREMIT or an analytical capability at every echelon? Why do we keep talking about police operations management? Well, this is what you got. So if our model is prevention, it requires proactivity, it requires predictability, it requires the patterns, it requires the data. Okay, what do you got to get that? Well, to get the data, we got to have collection techniques. Young MPs, whether they're investigators, whether they're guards in the facility that are observing certain things, advanced situational awareness, tactical questioning, field interviewing, and bringing that stuff in and doing a debrief. Collection and collection management. Companies have to be able in their operations cells put out a collection management plan. Here's what I want you to look for. Patterns of life. People, places, things they do, the times they do them. You got to be able to take those patterns and analyze them. You got to, and that's through crime analysis. You got to be able to turn it into actionable intelligence. Actionable intel products, not information products. Just giving information products to maneuver commanders is not going to help. They have to be actionable, and we have to talk about how we're going to help do that. That gets you to predictability. Proactivity is number of patrols, number of activities. You measure that by, I did this many patrols. That's my mom's. That's not going to be enough. To get to prevention, we have to do effects. I did 15 patrols on this route, but I still had 15 attacks at this hotspot on this MSR. It's not getting after the problem. That's why we have to move to here. Those capabilities, as we define them going forward from functional concepts, capabilities, concepts and capabilities, opportunities and threats come with the gaps, is these two things right here on how we have to look at that. Okay. Sarah, part of what we may have to do in doctrine, we'll flush it out, again, we're moving away from strictly measuring outputs to outcomes. We may have to have a focus because company commanders don't have staffs, but they're very good at tactical problem solving. We want them to be good at tactical problem solving. So we may have to stratify this as we go forward as a part of our technical expertise. So at the unit level, let's say that's a company and a platoon. Under all conditions, that's the police face to the public, to the human domain, whatever, getting after the mission. Marine policing may be something that we take it. And it's basic tactical problem solving. They only have 2 to 3 problems. They analyze them. Could be attacks on an MSR. Could be a problem in village X. Could be a problem in the housing area at Fort Bragg. I think a little more sophisticated, and Mike talked about CompStat, at our DES, battalion, brigade, and above, we may need to look at a little more sophisticated way of how we manage it. Because the DES or the battalion or the brigade, it's not going to manage 36 or 40 tactical problems across the core footprint in a combat operation. They're just not going to do it. This supports mission command, it supports decentralized execution, and it puts problem-solving tools in the hands of our platoon leaders and company commanders that can solve them on a decentralized way to that maneuver command. If it's a BCT, it's a BCT. But we put those tools in their hands through doctrine and through leader development. The bottom line is if we're going to improve it, control it, you got to understand it, first we got to measure it. And I think when we look at the tools we need, you know, the information technology tools, something in D6A to help us do that on the battlefield, that's what we're looking at.
Hey, Rob. Rob, can you go back to the last, right here, sorry. Can you go back to the previous slide for data?
I don't know, can I, sir?
If you could, that'd be great. You got about 2 minutes. Whoa. So this one right here. Okay, so this is the gap I think we have, and I'm interested to see how people overcome that gap. Because the intel we have, the criminal information we have, really is confined to our installations. I know in the alert system and previously in ACI Squared, we purposely do not share that information on our installations with those civilian law enforcement surrounding the installations. We built walls against sharing that information. We don't want visibility of what's happening on Fort Lewis, Fort Eustis, out in the civilian community.
Oh, that's a decision we have to make. So when you think of .NOPF solutions, there's a P at the very end. It's called policy. And that may be one of the hardest things. So when you think about third-party sharing protocols, I can give it to you, but you can't give it to somebody else. That's at the policy level. That's a problem in like you said, garrison policing. But when we talk about our combat going out under conditions,
I'm just talking about
that's a problem too. I mean, because you know we gotta fuse and be working very well with the MI community, because when they see the word intelligence after crime, they say, hey, what are you doing? Now, the other side of the coin is, yeah, but we're doing this because you don't have the knowledge to turn this data into actual products through the understanding of the criminal environment, this and the other. But that's where I think doctrine or policy is, hey, look, we're not going to give this information directly to the maneuver commander. We're going to come to you, G2, S2. We're going to fuse this with what you've already got for all source, and then we're going to go together with a unified front to that command. And I think that may be the way we have to think about it as we go forward to get that working. But what you would hope is in .NOPF solutions, and once we continue on, and possibly a CBA in the future, another one, you know, we're cranking out. What does it take, .NOPF, to get this going and get these capabilities in our hands so we can serve better enhanced maneuver? And oh, by the way, division commanders, the maneuver commanders we support, they're also field pilot and installation commanders. It's wonderful how that works.
Okay, at this time we are going to break in place for about 3 or 4 minutes. Stand up, stretch out. If you need to use the latrine, please use it. 8:45, we have a hard time to start our VTC with Major Charlie Green out of OPM.